The town of Graywood lay nestled in the country's southwestern region, renowned for its tranquility and unhurried pace of life. For years, nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened there. Its main street featured a handful of shops, a small cafe, a post office, and an old church that the locals faithfully attended every Sunday. The community largely comprised elderly residents and a few young families who cherished the town's stability. Among Graywood's inhabitants, James Randolph stood out as a figure of particular respect, a Vietnam War veteran and a local authority figure known and admired by all. James Randolph had returned to Graywood nearly 50 years ago, immediately after his discharge from military service. Back then, he had settled in a modest house on the outskirts of town with his wife Clara, who had patiently awaited his return from the war. Their marriage seemed solid and enduring, and within the next decade, they had three children, who became James's greatest pride. His eldest son, Thomas, followed in his father's footsteps by pursuing a career in law enforcement. His middle child, Elizabeth, worked at the local hospital, while the youngest, Laura, became a graphic designer and often commuted to the nearby city for work. James enjoyed an impeccable reputation. After his military service, he spent many years as a history teacher at the town's school, and upon retiring, he devoted himself to tending his garden and woodworking in his small workshop. He was an active member of the community, helping to organize local events and always ready to lend a hand. Over the years, his image as a veteran, a family man, and a kind-hearted individual became emblematic of Graywood itself. In July, James turned 78. As always, the occasion brought his entire family together at his home on the town's outskirts. After dinner, during which the children shared updates from their lives, Laura presented her father with an unusual gift, a DNA testing kit. She explained that it was a populous pastime that could reveal one's ancestry and potentially uncover distant familial connections. James accepted the gift with little enthusiasm, more to please his daughter than out of personal curiosity. Nevertheless, he completed the test. The following day, he mailed the sample and soon forgot about it as his daily routine resumed. A few weeks later, when the test results arrived via email, James retreated to his workshop to open the document. He expected nothing extraordinary. Yet that small box and the accompanying electronic report, which seemed so trivial at first, would soon trigger a series of events that would forever change his life and that of his family. The Randolph family had always been seen as a beacon of stability and harmony in the eyes of Graywood's community. But the revelations that began with this seemingly innocuous test would cast doubt on everything they had taken for granted. The quiet town, which had remained untouched by major upheavals for decades, became the stage for the unearthing of a secret that would shatter lives. The DNA test results arrived a few weeks later. James received an email containing a link to the lab report. Seeking solitude, he headed to his workshop, a place where he always felt at peace, and opened the file on his tablet. His eyes scanned lines of data, genetic markers, ancestral roots, and potential family connections. At first, the technical jargon meant little to him, but one section caught his attention, the one detailing biological relationships with other individuals, particularly immediate family members. It was there that James noticed something unusual. According to the report, he shared no biological connection with any of his children. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. Laboratories could make errors too, after all. Determined to verify, he reviewed the data again and again. Each time, the conclusion was the same. Neither Thomas, Elizabeth, nor Laura were his biological children. A wave of shock coursed through him, soon followed by a cold, simmering anger. Gripping the edge of his workbench, James felt a surge of outrage building within him. Dazed, James tried to rationalize the situation. Could this simply be a coincidence? But the facts refused to leave him in peace. He began to recall small, seemingly insignificant details from the past. The way some neighbors occasionally looked at him with a hint of pity. Or was it a veiled understanding of some unspoken truth? Back then, he had brushed off those fleeting moments as nonsense. But now, with the test results in front of him, those memories took on a more sinister significance. James also remembered how Clara had sometimes seemed distant during his extended deployments. At the time, he attributed it to the struggles every family faces when a spouse is away for long periods. But now that distance felt like something entirely different. His thoughts spiraled back to evenings when Henry Maxwell, their neighbor and longtime family friend, would visit to help around the house, his cheerful smile directed at the children. Then there were the seemingly innocuous conversations with Clara that left James with a vague sense of unease, though he had dismissed them at the time. Henry had always been around, and now that fact only left a bitter taste. James felt as though he was losing control of his thoughts. What if everything he had believed in, everything he had built, was founded on a lie? Could Clara, his wife, have betrayed him in the worst possible way? And the most haunting question of all, if he wasn't their biological father, who were his children? Really, James told no one. He spent the next few days absorbed in his own mind, rarely leaving his workshop. Clara noticed his silence but didn't dare press him. James avoided all conversations, striving to maintain an outward calm, though an emotional storm raged within. Doubt gradually gave way to suspicion, which only deepened as he reread the test results over and over. James realized he couldn't move forward until he uncovered the truth. It wasn't merely a matter of personal curiosity. It had become a question of honor and dignity. His first step was to prepare for a confrontation with Clara. He knew it was inevitable and feared the consequences, but he couldn't live in ignorance any longer. In his mind, one question began to form, the question he would ask her, "Did you betray me?" That thought haunted him day and night, consuming his every waking moment, and so the path of destruction had already been set in motion. What had seemed like a trivial and even entertaining gift had unleashed a chain of events that would irrevocably shatter the peace of the Randolph household. A few days after receiving the DNA test results, James decided it was finally time to confront Clara. All this time, he had tried to maintain an outward sense of calm, but the tension within him was reaching a breaking point. He knew this conversation would change everything, and he felt he had no other choice. Taking the report with him, James climbed the stairs to the living room where Clara was sitting and placed the document on the table in front of her. Her face first showed surprise, but within moments her expression shifted to one of anxiety. James explained the issue. The DNA results revealed that he was not the biological father of any of their 3 children. Clara listened silently, her hands clenched together, her eyes slowly welling with tears. When he finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. Clara struggled to respond. Her shoulders trembled as she tried to gather her thoughts, but her demeanor betrayed the presence of a hidden truth. Finally, in a quiet, trembling voice, she said, "I can't keep this secret any longer." What followed was a confession that unraveled decades of deception. Clara admitted that many years ago, during James's long military and work-related absences, she had begun to feel deeply lonely. During that time, Henry Maxwell, their neighbor and close family friend, became a source of comfort for her. At first, it had been nothing more than innocent conversations and shared meals, but over time, their relationship developed into an affair. James listened in silence, his face unreadable. Every word from Clara felt like a dagger. She confessed that all 3 of their children were fathered by Henry. In that moment, James's worst suspicions were confirmed. The orderly, peaceful life he had built was crumbling before his eyes. Everything he had invested his heart and soul into, everything he believed in, turned out to be built on lies. Clara tried to explain her actions, speaking of her loneliness and fears. She said she had always loved James and never wanted to lose him, but his long absences and the emotional distance between them had driven her to seek solace elsewhere. She insisted that Henry had never interfered in their family life and that James had always been the real father to the children in every way but biologically. But for James, these words meant nothing. His focus was locked on one devastating fact. He had been deceived for decades. The honesty and trust on which he had always based his relationships were shattered. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way forward, but one thing was certain. He could no longer live as if nothing had happened. James stood up and, without saying another word, walked out of the room. He returned to his workshop, his sanctuary, but even there he felt like a stranger. His thoughts churned, and with every passing moment, his anger deepened. He recalled how Henry had spent countless hours in their home, helping with household tasks, playing with the children, and joking over dinners. It all now seemed like a calculated betrayal that had infiltrated every aspect of his life. This truth poisoned James's thoughts, and he began to contemplate his next steps. He couldn't accept that Henry, the man he had trusted, was the cause of his family's ruin. The question of whether he could forgive Clara didn't even arise. His thoughts were consumed by one thing: confronting Henry. James knew that such a confrontation was inevitable. The stable world James had once believed in was now bracing for even greater upheaval. The following evening, James Randolph steeled himself for what he believed to be inevitable: a confrontation with Henry Maxwell. Ever since his conversation with Clara, he had been unable to find peace. Rage and despair consumed him, and Henry's betrayal, which now seemed undeniable, demanded answers. James felt compelled to look the man who had been part of his life and the source of his deepest pain directly in the eyes. Around 8 in the evening, James grabbed his coat and stepped out of the house. The night was dark, but the warm summer air lightly stirred the branches of the trees. The walk to Henry's house was short, no more than a few minutes, yet it felt like an eternity. James moved silently, his mind focused, his resolve unshaken. Henry's house stood slightly apart from the other homes in Graywood. Light glowed from its windows, and through the curtains, James could see the silhouette of a man seated in an armchair, holding a book. James climbed the porch steps and knocked loudly on the door. Within seconds, Henry appeared, his face registering a flicker of surprise that quickly gave way to a guarded unease. James didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside without a word, leaving the door open behind him. The confrontation began in tense silence. James pulled a folded piece of paper, a copy of the DNA test results, from his pocket and handed it to Henry. As Henry looked at the document, his expression shifted. It was clear he understood the situation even before James began to speak. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere filled the room. James broke the silence, his voice steady but underlined with simmering fury. He asked Henry to confirm what Clara had told him. After a brief pause, Henry nodded, admitting that he was the biological father of James' children. He tried to offer an explanation, claiming that the affair with Clara had occurred during a difficult time for both of them. Henry insisted that he had never intended to destroy James's family and had deliberately stayed out of the children's lives. But these words offered James no solace. They did nothing to erase the sense of betrayal that now consumed him. His voice began to rise, and the restrained tone gave way to raw emotion. He accused Henry of a treachery that had stolen everything he held dear. The tension escalated quickly. Henry, though attempting to remain calm, grew defensive, which only further fueled James' anger. The argument intensified, their words cutting deeper with each exchange. Finally, James could no longer contain himself. He stormed out of the house, but instead of walking away, he headed straight to his workshop, located nearby. In the workshop, surrounded by his tools and unfinished projects, James opened a drawer and retrieved an old revolver, a relic from his military days. For years, the gun had merely been a reminder of the past, a symbol rather than a tool. But now something inside him had shifted. The world he had built on principles of honor and justice was gone, and he felt he had no choice but to act. James returned to Henry's house. His steps were heavy but deliberate. He entered again without knocking. Henry was still in the living room, seated as if waiting for James to return, though he didn't seem prepared for what was about to unfold. What happened next shattered the stillness of Graywood's night. The sound was sharp and loud, piercing through the silence and causing the neighboring dogs to howl. Henry fell, and James, without hesitation, turned and walked back to his home. Clara was waiting for him on the porch, her face pale, her eyes filled with dread. She already seemed to know what had occurred. In the dim light of their home, James made one final decision. Another sound broke the night's silence. That night in Graywood marked the beginning of events that would not only tear apart the Randolph family, but also shatter the peace of the entire community. The next morning, the quiet streets of Graywood were disturbed by a call to the police. Concerned neighbors, noticing that the lights in Henry Maxwell's house had remained on all night, decided to check if everything was all right. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the small town. Henry was found lying unconscious on the floor of his living room. The police arrived within minutes. Detectives examined the scene and began collecting evidence. However, the real shock came a few hours later when another call alerted authorities to a second incident, this time at the Randolph household. Upon arriving, the police found Clara lying unconscious in the living room. All evidence pointed to one person, James. James was arrested without resistance. He sat calmly on the steps of his house, waiting for the police to arrive. He didn't say a word as they led him away in handcuffs, but his eyes betrayed the deep inner collapse he was experiencing. The news of what had happened spread like wildfire through Graywood. No one could believe that the town's hero, a man who had always been regarded as the embodiment of honesty and kindness, could have done such a thing. People stopped on the streets to exchange whispers about the events that seemed impossible in their quiet corner of the world. "How could this happen?" neighbors murmured among themselves. "This is James. He's always been the perfect citizen." A sense of unease settled over the town. People feared for their own safety. But they were also haunted by the question, what could have driven James to such a drastic act? The answer, which came through the police investigation, only deepened the community's shock. The revelation that none of James' 3 children were his biological offspring became a town-wide scandal. At first, it seemed so unbelievable that many refused to accept it, but the DNA test results left no room for doubt. The Randolph family, once seen as a model of unity and love, was now exposed as a facade, concealing decades of hidden truths. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Laura, who had rushed back to Graywood, were as stunned as everyone else. The 3 of them struggled to comprehend how their family life could unravel so suddenly. Elizabeth, typically composed and reserved, couldn't hold back her tears as she endured the judgmental stares of the townsfolk. She felt as though every whispered conversation around her only deepened their collective pain. Laura, whose gift of the DNA test had set everything in motion, was overwhelmed with guilt and barely left the house, unable to face the people of Graywood. The community, which had once greeted the Randolphs with smiles, now turned its back on them. Everyone understood that the long-buried secret, finally unearthed, had caused a tragedy that tore apart not only one family, but also the trust and harmony within the town itself. A memorial service for Clara and Henry was held at the local church, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Most avoided speaking about James, though it was clear he was the central figure in the tragedy. The local priest, striving to offer words of comfort, remarked that this was a story about how hidden truths could destroy even the strongest of bonds. Life in Graywood would never be the same. A town that once prided itself on its unity and peace now served as a grim reminder of the dangers lurking behind closed doors. The trial of James Randolph became the most significant event in Graywood's history, drawing attention not only from the small town, but also from neighboring regions. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to follow the unfolding drama that felt more like a television crime series than real life. Newspaper headlines blared, "War hero and model father charged with double homicide." What were the Randolphs hiding? And betrayal that ended in tragedy. James offered no resistance when arrested and made no attempt to evade responsibility. At the first hearing, he declined legal representation, stating that he had no intention of defending himself. This decision shocked many, including his children, who pleaded with him to accept legal help. But James remained resolute. He stood in the courtroom with a straight posture, calm but visibly aged, as though the weight of the years and the recent revelations had left an indelible mark on him. The prosecution built its case on clear evidence. Neighbors' testimonies about hearing gunshots that night, the weapon found at the crime scene, and the results of ballistic tests. The prosecutor painted James as a man who had lost control after learning of the betrayal revealed by the DNA test. Overwhelmed by rage, they argued, he had committed the ultimate act of violence. The court-appointed defense team, assigned after James's refusal to hire a lawyer, argued that his actions were the result of intense emotional trauma. They highlighted the shock he suffered upon discovering that his children were not biologically his and stressed his fragile mental state in the aftermath. However, James did not participate in these discussions. He sat silently as his life was dissected in front of a room full of onlookers. Witnesses were called to testify. First among them were Thomas, Elizabeth, and Laura. Their testimonies were filled with pain and confusion. Thomas, trying to remain composed, spoke with a trembling voice as he described the father he had always admired as a pillar of strength. Elizabeth broke down in tears as she recounted how they had all learned the truth about their parentage. a truth that had torn their family apart. Laura, who had brought the DNA test into their lives, appeared utterly shattered, barely able to speak as she blamed herself for triggering the catastrophic chain of events. Neighbors who had known James for decades also testified. Some expressed sympathy, recalling his acts of kindness and his contributions to the community. Others, however, called for the harshest punishment, arguing that betrayal did not justify murder. The trial lasted several weeks, with tensions in the courtroom mounting each day. Finally, the pivotal moment arrived. The prosecutor's closing arguments and James's opportunity to speak. The prosecutor depicted James as a man who had succumbed to primal instincts, destroying lives and devastating his family. When it was time for James to give his final statement, the courtroom fell into a deep silence. He rose and delivered a brief yet poignant speech, more a confession than a defense. "I did what I did, and I'm not seeking excuses. My life was built on honesty and loyalty. To discover that all of it was a lie was a blow I could not endure. I take full responsibility for my actions and am prepared to accept the verdict." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. People whispered, debating whether his words were a genuine expression of remorse or part of a calculated strategy. Hours later, the jury returned with their decision: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. James received the sentence without a trace of emotion. His gaze remained fixed, and he did not look at his children, who sat sobbing in the audience. Thus the trial came to an end, but for Graywood it was merely the beginning of a long process of coming to terms with the events that had irreversibly changed their lives. After the trial, which ended with James Randolph being sentenced to life imprisonment, his 3 children were left to face a harsh new reality that forever altered their lives. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Laura, who had once felt secure as part of a close-knit family, now found themselves grappling with the painful aftermath of their shattered world. The life they had built on love and trust had crumbled to ruins. Thomas, the eldest, bore the heaviest burden of responsibility. Following the verdict, he decided to remain in Graywood to support his sisters and preserve whatever was left of their family's memory. He took on the role of protector, striving to provide some semblance of stability during this difficult time. Thomas left his job in law enforcement in the city and returned to the family home, which now felt cold and empty. He found work at a local security company, though his heart was no longer in it. Elizabeth, the middle child, was the most emotionally fragile. She struggled to maintain her composure, but with each passing day, she became more withdrawn. Her work at the hospital, which had once brought her a sense of purpose and comfort, now only reminded her of loss and pain. Elizabeth spent most of her time at home, avoiding interactions with neighbors, whose judgmental stares and hushed conversations only deepened her sense of isolation. She began attending therapy sessions, but even that couldn't fully ease her suffering. Laura, the youngest, was consumed by guilt, convinced that her gift, the DNA test, had been the catalyst for the tragedy. She believed that had it not been for the test, their family might have remained intact, even with its hidden secrets. The weight of this guilt crushed her. Unable to face the judgment of the townspeople or the memories of her actions, Laura moved to another city. She found a new job in graphic design, but she felt as though her life would never return to normal. The Graywood community, which had once been a source of support for the Randolphs, now turned its back on them. People avoided contact with Thomas, Elizabeth, and Laura, seeing them as living reminders of the scandal that had tarnished the town. Friends who had once joined them for family dinners now crossed the street to avoid them, unwilling to meet their gaze. This was particularly hard on Thomas, who visited his father in prison every week. Each visit felt like an ordeal. Seeing James, worn and diminished, only deepened his pain. Their conversations were brief and strained, with James answering questions in short, detached sentences, never mentioning the events that had destroyed their family. To James, the matter seemed closed, but for Thomas, the wound remained raw, refusing to heal. Elizabeth mustered the courage to visit her father once, but after that, she couldn't bring herself to go again. She felt an unbridgeable gap between them, a wound too deep to be mended. She couldn't forgive him, nor could she reconcile the man she had loved with the one who had caused such immense pain. Laura, despite moving away, often thought of her father and longed to see him, to find some closure. Yet she could never bring herself to face him. Her life was now divided into before and after, and she felt unsure how to reconnect with a family that no longer existed as it once had. Time passed, but the pain and the town's judgment remained unchanged. The Randolph family had become a symbol of disintegration and tragedy, a cautionary tale whispered about but rarely discussed openly. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Laura carried on with their lives, each trying in their own way to move forward, but the shadow of the past followed them relentlessly. Their story became a painful reminder of how quickly the foundation of a family could collapse when built on hidden truths and broken trust. The tragedy of the Randolph family left a deep scar on the town of Graywood, serving as a powerful lesson about the destructive force of hidden secrets. For decades, the Randolphs had appeared to be the perfect family, a symbol of love, respect, and harmony. James Randolph was a revered figure, a war veteran, a mentor to the younger generation, a devoted husband, and a caring father. Yet behind this idealized facade lay a truth that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The story quickly spread beyond Graywood, drawing the attention of journalists, psychologists, and even writers, all of whom sought to unravel the mystery behind what had happened. Each tried to pinpoint the root cause of the tragedy. Some believed that the key lay in James's psychological state, strained by years of military service and the burden of unfulfilled expectations. Others focused on Clara's role and her decision to keep the truth about the children's paternity a secret. But most agreed on one thing: the foundation of the tragedy was the absence of honesty, which had silently eroded the family from within. For Graywood, the events were a wake-up call that shattered the illusion of their quiet town's immunity to such turmoil. People began to question how well they truly knew their neighbors, friends, and even their own family members. Discussions about trust, family values, and the importance of transparency permeated church services and community gatherings. Yet at the same time, many avoided the topic, fearing that it might strike too close to home. For Thomas, Elizabeth, and Laura, life became a relentless struggle to cope with the aftermath. Thomas continued to take on the role of protector, striving to restore some sense of normalcy for himself and his sisters. He knew that his father would forever remain a paradoxical figure in his life, a man he deeply loved and respected, yet whose actions had caused immeasurable pain. Elizabeth, seeking solace, eventually left her job at the hospital and turned to volunteer work, helping people who had experienced trauma. For her, this became a way to heal her own wounds, even if only partially. Laura, who had moved to a different city, worked hard to build a new life, but couldn't escape the shadow of her past. For years, she carried the guilt of knowing that her DNA test gift had set the entire tragedy in motion. Eventually, she channeled her pain into writing a book about her family, chronicling every event in painstaking detail. The book stirred a wide public response and became a stark warning about the dangers of keeping secrets. James, serving his life sentence, remained silent and withdrawn. He rarely accepted visitors and never responded to letters. For him, life had lost all meaning. During one of Thomas's rare visits, James offered parting words: "My mistakes cost me everything. Don't repeat them." Over time, new generations grew up in Graywood, hearing of the Randolph tragedy only through stories passed down or from old newspaper clippings. Yet for those who had witnessed it firsthand, the memory remained an open wound. The story of James Randolph became a cautionary tale about the importance of being truthful with oneself and one's loved ones, and how even the strongest family bonds could be destroyed by lies and betrayal. This story was no longer just a tragedy of one family. It became a warning to others. People began to reflect more deeply on the secrets they harbored and whether they could bear the consequences if those secrets were ever exposed. The lesson, though painful, was clear. Even the smallest of secrets could become a ticking time bomb, capable of destroying everything once held sacred. Thus, the story of the Randolph family came to an end, leaving behind a shadow that would linger over Graywood for years to come. Though life in the town continued, its residents would never look at one another the same way again.